On behalf of the Institute Community and Equity Office, MindHandHeart, and the MIT Department of Athletics, Physical Education, and Recreation, I'd like to welcome you all to our Calling In event with Professor Loretta J. Ross. Loretta describes herself as a radical Black feminist, a scholar, and a human rights activist. In 1978, she began working at the very first rape crisis center in the country and has since committed decades to intersectional social movement building, ranging from the National Anti-Klan Network to co-founding Sister Song, Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. She approaches this work in ways that are both open-minded and large-hearted, a philosophy that she has personally put to the test as a Black woman who has worked with white supremacists and as a sexual assault survivor who has worked with incarcerated offenders. By calling in rather than calling out and engaging in tough but worthwhile conversations, Loretta has continued to find joy in anti-racist work, in her classrooms, in her writing, and in her life. As someone who personally practices calling in behavior, I'm very excited about this learning and growing opportunity for our community. And I have a piece of breaking news. Earlier today, Loretta received tenure at her home institution, Smith College. Please join me in congratulating Professor Loretta Ross.
Thank you.
Before turning it over to you, Loretta, I'd like to briefly introduce my colleague, Dr. Anthony Grant, Director of Athletics and Department Head of DAPER, who will be joining me in moderating the Q&A section of our program after Loretta presents. We ask that you keep your microphones muted during the event, but if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand at the end of the presentation, and Anthony and I will get to them. Thank you again, Anthony, for the partnership. And now I turn it over to you, our newly tenured professor, Loretta Ross. Welcome.
Thank you. Y'all caught me on like a really good day because I've only been at Smith 2 years. And so to get offered tenure kind of out of the blue and in the middle of the COVID crisis is so unexpected. And I feel so unworthy. Happy to be at Smith and happy to be here with y'all today. I've got a mashup presentation for y'all because as we were planning this presentation, people wanted me to talk about the joy of being an activist, along with fighting white supremacy and along with calling in, which actually are 3 separate presentations. So I mashed them up for y'all. So I will be offering a little bit on each of those in the time we have available. I do want to invite you to start organizing your questions so that there won't be a lot of dead space when we get to the Q&A portion of the event, because we do have a time certain that we're going to stop. And let me start by sharing my screen and hope that I've learned enough about PowerPoint and how to do that already. Hopefully you can see this, right? Yes, no, maybe?
We can, Loretta, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I really am an accidental feminist because I started out when I went to Howard University in 1970, majoring in chemistry and physics, but my life took a left-wing turn when I started getting involved in Black nationalist and feminist politics. You've heard my bio, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but you may know what I do, but you may not know why I do it. And I am a human rights activist. I'm very proud to call myself that. I actually heard from my previous boss, Reverend C.T. Vivian, who passed last summer, that Dr. King meant for us to build a human rights movement, not just a civil rights movement. And so every time I heard this astonishing news in 1990, I've been calling myself a human rights activist because everybody told me Dr. King had a dream, but nobody told me he had a plan. And so I've been very much making sure that we all know that the way that we can bring all of our intersectional selves together is through the human rights framework. So that's why I do this work. I'm building the human rights movement to beat back authoritarianism, neo-fascism, and white supremacy. I want to start with a quote from Grace Lee Boggs because it situates us in this historical context where we are when democracy seems so precarious right now. You cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for it, unless you see yourself as belonging to it and responsible for changing it. And so that's our mission today, if we choose to accept it, to try to change the society that we're in. And so I'm going to start by talking about how do you find joy and inspiration in anti-racism work. I firmly believe, since I became an activist at 16 and now I'm 67, that activism is the art of making your life matter. I have not been bored since I became an activist. I've never gotten out of bed one time trying to figure out why I'm on this earth. Because if you serve people through your life's work, you'll actually always know what your mission is. And you have to learn how to do it with joy and inspiration, or you can't do it in a sustainable way. I call it having that consciousness toggle switch that you can turn on and off so that you can actually be as serious as you want to be about doing the human rights work that makes your life matter, but at the same time, toggle the thing, your consciousness off so that you can actually watch, Hulu without doing a critical analysis of everything. I mean, really. So tonight we're going to talk about appropriate whiteness and effective allyship, how important it is to really do accurate threat assessments, that we really do this work because we appreciate our interdependence as human beings and see diversity as a strength. I find that becoming a human rights activist helped me be all I ever wanted to be in learning how to work not only domestically, but globally with the global struggle for human rights. And I very intentionally work in this world because I want to make the world less cruel than it is right now. And I've also discovered my joy in this human rights work because it's about the freedom to become more rather than the freedom to own more. I find that owning myself is the greatest gift I can give to myself, much more than money can buy. And through this calling in process, you're going to find that learning to forgive oneself is very necessary for learning how to forgive others. And I'll be talking about that. Another important distinction to make is to help you understand the difference between blame versus responsibility. Unless you're Methuselah, no one is alive who created the system of white supremacy that we're all in right now, the toxic sea in which we all swim. But we all bear responsibility for ending it. And I'm bringing into the conversation the metaphor from Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste. Imagine that you just bought a house, an older house, but you just bought it. But with this house, the foundation is bad and the plumbing is bad. Now, it's not your fault that that house has bad foundation and bad plumbing, but it is your responsibility to fix it if you're going to enjoy the privilege of benefiting from and owning that house. And that's where our country is today. No one is alive who created this system, but we all have a responsibility for addressing the fragility of our democracy, the rise of authoritarianism on a global level, and the way that those of us who are trying to offer a critique of the system are being castigated as improperly promoting critical race theory and trying to destroy Western civilization, which is a whole nother conversation that I won't get into too much. Tim Wise is a young man that I met in the 1990s when he started fighting David Duke down in Louisiana. And he is wise, so he has the right name. And he writes that when your anti-racism is a product of your progressive or left-wing political commitments, rather than an outgrowth of your lived experiences, it can easily prove transient. Politics and ideology can change, but the shit you've seen is the shit you've seen. And that is forever. In other words, my understanding of racism grew from what I saw, not what I read about. And that's where we find joy in doing this work, because we stop gaslighting ourselves and we affirm that we can believe our eyes and our lived experiences. And that's what makes us have sustainability in the movement. So I'm going to start by saying, how does white supremacy hurt white people? First of all, I think the greatest blow, and why it seems so intractable, is that there's a conflation of white identity with white supremacist ideology. Of course, an ideology is a body of ideas, an organized worldview. Whiteness is simply an identity. And yet the white identity has been so weaponized to support white supremacy that we end up with a lot of people very confused about how they can embrace a white identity without embracing the ideology of white supremacy. But I beg you to remember that, first of all, not all white people are white supremacists, which is important, but also not all white supremacists are white. It is possible for anyone to embrace the ideology of white supremacy, and it's equally possible to embrace and be proud of a white identity without white supremacy. But it's very hard to do because there's been multi-generational brainwashing to believe in the system of meritocracy. And that is very hard to overcome. Once you start learning how rigged the system is, then you start feeling rather cynical and hopeless that anything can be done. And unfortunately, part of that brainwashing helps many people who have white identity actually oppose any improvements in the social welfare contract, if in fact they think that these improvements, like providing health care or universal education or any of those benefits that we should be enjoying, if they think that those benefits are going to also happen for Black people or immigrants or Muslims or whatever, they'd rather die for lack of health care, as Dr. Jonathan Metzl's book said in Dying of Whiteness. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. And what this confusion does is create feelings of guilt, shame, and sometimes even defiant justification, instead of learning about how we can take responsibility for fixing the situation. And then those of us who want to do something about the situation feel afraid to just say what's on our minds, because for fear someone will jump down our throats if we say the wrong thing. So we feel like we're walking on eggshells. And even if we tell our truth, it won't be believed because we think we'll get gaslighted. And then one other unhelpful thing that white supremacy does to hurt white people is that they always want to feel the need for forgiveness for their past thoughts and behaviors. And as I said, it starts with self-forgiveness as opposed to using the movement as our public therapy spaces to seek for communal or group forgiveness. And part of the damage is done through artificial binaries like good, bad, right, wrong, good, good, evil. And when you use such an absolutist binary system, you miss most of the nuances of life, and you definitely miss the complexity of humanity. And then there's this pursuit of perfectionism and the assumption, which I probably should call presumption, of objectivity, neither of which is true nor actually attainable. And what it also leads to is the inability to separate criticisms about racist behaviors or words from criticisms about moral character. So if somebody has a problem with something that a white person says that may or may not be racist, what the white person will always hear when it's identified is that you've attacked their morality, their ability to see themselves as good people. And then even those who are trying to be woke and work on these issues feel overloaded with too much information and fear of being called out. And one of the things that's really interesting about the Northeast Corridor, where I spend a lot of time, is that when you meet anti-racist white people, they're really trying earnestly to show that they're the good white people against all the bad white people who are more racist. and yet they walk around in perpetual fear of being written off because they say something problematic. And so I'm going to talk about how we address all of these things. It starts, first of all, with breaking up with shame, like Sonia Renee Taylor talks about. She wrote a wonderful book called The Body Is Not an Apology. And studies have proven that when you have positive feelings about one's ethnic identity, it leads to resilience, it leads to strength. And so one of the things that I think is necessary is to turn white fragility into white courage, which I'll be talking about. Kai-Ching Tom is an excellent writer who separates that guilt is feeling bad about something that you've actually done, where shame is feeling bad about who you are, often which you had no control over. And that's why shame is such a useless emotion in doing human rights work. And guilt, that means that you need to repair whatever harm you've done. And you can't have authentic relationships with compassion when you're leading with your shame and your guilt. And one of the other things that we need to avoid with in addition to the binaries is our fear of ambiguity and nuance, because the best knowledge is in the lacuna, in the borderlands. And we need to appreciate that complexity and how 360 that makes our worldview when we live purposefully and with joy in the borderlands. And then we've got to learn to stop flinching from perceived threats. Again, that accurate threat assessment that I talked about and I'll continue to talk about. Also understanding the difference between problematic allies and actual opponents. So just because somebody uses the wrong word or doesn't know the latest lexicon, or you think they're just being a performative activist, they're still our allies, as opposed to people who are actual opponents, and I'll talk about that. And I really am eager to work with people to teach about white pride without white supremacy, because I don't think that the only people who should be talking about white pride are the fascists and the Klansmen. I mean, I'm certainly proud of being a Black woman. I would like to work with people who are proud about being who they are too. And we've got to address what really is an undercurrent of resentment amongst liberals when we try to do DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and talk about what is necessary for true human liberation. And then there's always going to be a backlash to people who work to end human rights violations. And so we're going to have to understand how we need to build firewalls to protect these people, even as they occupy different positions in the work. So appropriate whiteness is a concept that I mentioned before. I believe it's how white people reclaim their humanity without the politics of domination that is invited by white supremacy. So as I said, develop white courage instead of white fragility, how to use white privilege very strategically, and I'll be talking about that more. There's all kinds of gradations of whiteness that I'm just now beginning to learn about, but I find that class can compromise white privilege, for example, and that's why people often rebut, I don't have privilege. I had to work for everything I've got. And so we really got to interrogate those class and ethnic issues amongst those who are read as white by society, and then also understand how provisional that white characteristic or identity can be, because if you manifest as Jewish, or if you manifest as coming from a whole bunch of different religions or different parts of the world, you're on probation permanently in terms of people who use blood politics around whiteness. And of course, this brainwashing that I talked about, and the way that there is an assault on truth, evidence, and memory taking place. We need to share the truth about our country's history, the good and the bad. And I think appropriate whiteness can be used to help define and explain not only microaggressions, those little cuts that we're capable of giving to each other, but also flip the script and talk about micro affirmations and micro resistance. We can all do little things to both affirm our humanity and that of others and resist. the playbook that white supremacy provides. And I think one of the reasons that it's so hard for people to learn about and practice appropriate whiteness is because of the suppression of stories of white abolitionists in the past, even as the concept of white supremacy was created and codified in this emerging United States of Virginia. There were white people who were in opposition to it. But other than John Brown, we don't know who they were, and John Brown got hung. So there certainly aren't a whole lot of white role models that are known to us, which we need to excavate and study. And I think the calling in culture is what we need to use to build white identities based on human rights. Now, Ibram Kendi has been very popular with his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and I'll go through it fairly quickly. He categorizes three types of humanity. I think his analysis is overly simplified, but here it is. You're born white, and despite what genetic diversity says, you believe in biological determinism and that your biological future depends on the protection of that presumed whiteness. And you have the lineage, the privileges, and the responsibilities that is entailed in claiming that whiteness identity and that blood politics. And he calls all those people racist. Then he says that the next set of people are born white, and no matter what they do, the white supremacist environment will always have you embracing, performing, and sustaining white privilege. He calls that assimilationist. Now, this is where I have the most problems with Kendi, because assimilationism seems to be a too large a bucket to classify or create a taxonomy from, because under this kind of framework of assimilationism, you've got President Obama and Mitch McConnell. And any classification system that has them both believing the same thing, I think needs some more work. But then the third one is that you're born white and your free will can override and challenge whiteness and white supremacy. And you can imagine or reinvent yourself out of whiteness as part of an anti-racist project. This is unfortunately where 20 years of whiteness studies has landed. They do an accurate analysis of the construction of whiteness, but at the end of every book I read from whiteness studies, it always ends in the same place. Just learn how to be less white. And every time I read that very disappointing conclusion, I'm like, you're telling an entire set of people who have been racialized as white that they somehow can personally try to be less white. How in the world is that supposed to happen? And that's probably why it fails. And the people who embrace that as their mission end up using cultural appropriation and fictive kinships and all kinds of ways to try to live being less white. I would rather encourage a fourth analysis of appropriate whiteness, where you're born human and you are white, and you get to choose whether your human identity can be self-determination, even as you are constituted socially, economically, and biologically as white. You know, that means using the human rights framework and not being afraid of being white or indulging in white guilt or paralysis, but defining yourself in relationship to whiteness as an identity and white supremacy as an ideology. And this allows you to move from guilt and anger into action. I think that there can be intentional learning about white courage and defining what being proud of being white means to you. That's the process of self-reclamation and self-determination. And then you can use the advantages of whiteness to deconstruct white supremacy, not on behalf of people of color or BIPOCs, as they say, but on behalf of white people. You know, strategically using whiteness against white supremacy, the same way we can use the male identity to counter sexism, for example. And this is where knowledge of self and practices of self-love become vital, because we believe in the power of the human rights framework and human interconnectedness and interdependence. And from this reclamation project, you can build new and authentic relationships across differences. So this requires looking very intently at the concept of white privilege. You know, people say white privilege in a very judgmental way, basically saying that there's undeserved good fortune working that you're experiencing, but that actually isn't what the word means. You know, it really just describes a benefit that comes from a certain set of conditions. And to privilege something means to elevate it, to treat it favorably. So, you know, that's one of the reasons that the term white privilege gets us in trouble. And when you talk about white privilege, you're really combining two different things, racial privilege and economic or class privilege. Except for poor white people, their racial privilege is compromised by their lack of class privilege. And we need to understand this nuance. So white privilege is not primarily class-based. At its root, white privilege only means that as part of the majority population, a white person is statistically less likely to experience a given hardship based on their race. The privilege here is a lower risk of harm. And that means that, you know, your racial identity is measurably less likely to be a detrimental factor in life, whether it's a traffic stop, a doctor's visit, a classroom, than if you were Black or brown. And that's white privilege in its passive form. And you really don't have to do anything to earn it. And you can go about your whole day never thinking about it. Matter of fact, I know people who live low lives never thinking about your race in any of those settings. In a more forward-looking way, you can actually do a passive privilege check and look back over your life and see how many times your race has prevented you from doing something, has imperiled you in some way. And if you can't think of anything, then you have experienced white privilege. And part of the white privilege is not realizing that it's a privilege. And the active version of white privilege is when whiteness does provide specific advantages, i.e. in mortgage assessments for homes and things like that, or advancement in the corporate world. And sometimes the passive and the active versions go hand in hand. Sometimes they don't. But when they don't correspond and work together, class is almost always the reason. And your personal lack of economic privilege may well mean that you never experienced the active advantages of whiteness consciously and firsthand. And so I'm gonna stop this animation because I'm trying to go faster. Linda Martin Alcoff has written a wonderful book called The Future of Whiteness. And we need to acknowledge that there's limited white experience in fighting white supremacy. And most white people really don't even want to address it out of their self-interest. But when you do, it can lead to fuller self-development. And you can align your internal self-interest with the fight of white supremacy. And this starts by normalizing the discussion of whiteness in everyday conversations. I don't know what's happening, but my computer is crashing. Let me see if it's gonna keep that. Can y'all see those green lines that suddenly appeared in my computer? That's interesting. Anyway, and so we've got to not be afraid of talking about white privilege, but in fact leverage it to make a difference in how people live whiteness and move on, that people are rewarded for not seeing their racial privilege. And because they don't see it, they're often unaware of how their ideological beliefs really do work to oppress others. And we can use calling in strategies to help them see these things. And because it happens to all white people, I believe that anti-racist white people can use their innate understanding of where those other white people ideas come from, and how these patterns of unconscious racism is socialized into performing whiteness, and how they can form belief systems that support white supremacy. And I think that anti-racist white people can really identify with other white people's assumptions and misunderstandings because they shared those same beliefs at one time themselves, and they can zero in on those assumptions and really speak to them with compassion and navigate the conversation constructively. But it's not about being nice, and instead of taking responsibility for your actions, niceness is not the answer, personal niceness, because that rests on an assumption of colorblindness, and your proximity to people of color doesn't erase racism. It's called fictive kinship, actually. But relationships can be used to distinguish between personal racism and racist outcomes. So there's a way to talk to political opponents. I believe that most people, even people standing in front of me in the KKK and stuff, will insist that they're not racist because they equate being racist with being personally mean to other people. So my Uncle Frank's strategy, if I know them, is try to persuade them to align what their interior good opinion of themselves is with their external behaviors. And sometimes the hardest part is listening to them. But we can learn to speak in the tones and the registers and the words that they can hear. And it's not going to be our gift to change them in the moment, because it's just really more important to speak up and build that firewall against bigotry. And silence can be interpreted as consent. So, don't just be silent out of fear because it says you're okay what's going on. But through calling in, I'm going to teach you how to challenge these people through love and respect. And we all carry a lot of embedded programming. And then if we change that programming, we can then change the external laws and structures that keep racism in place. And we really do need more good, patient people to have these conversations, even if our patience is wearing thin. But we don't have a choice about this. We can't give up. But we have to remember that other people are as complicated as we are. And self-forgiveness, as I said before, is a key to forgiving others. And many times, since you don't have that magic power to immediately change people, you will not be there to witness any epiphanies that can happen. So when you're calling in racist, make sure you understand that we're all struggling with creativity and courage for our freedom. And we need to support healing processes with accountability for all. We, again, need to talk about that difference between blame and responsibility. We can separate white supremacy as an ideology from identity. And we really need to address the poverty of intellect, the banality of ideas, and the lack of imagination that maintains white supremacy. One of the things that is quite amusing is how unoriginal white supremacists can be, because they've been on the same track around fears of white racial extinction for 400 years. And so we need to recognize that we actually do need white people to deconstruct white supremacy. And it's not a personal problem, it's a systemic problem that can be held up by person. So Elie Wiesel talks about how we always have to take sides, because neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. And silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. So I'm gonna switch right now and start talking about calling out. Calling in, calling out, and calling on is part of a continuum. We all know what calling out is. It's publicly shaming people for something you think they've done wrong or something you think that they've said wrong. And the word that's working the hardest in that sentence is public, publicly shaming people. Calling on is an intermediate step where, in fact, you're not investing in another person's growth, but you're calling on them to be a better human being. My favorite calling on sentence is, I beg your pardon. And I just let it lay there while they recalibrate what just came out of their mouths. I haven't called them out. I haven't called them in. I just called their attention to the fact that there's nothing about me that wants to encourage you to repeat those remarks in my presence. And calling in is making the intentional investment to help another person grow. And that's what I'll be talking about. But first, calling out. Just criticizing other people's practices, weaponizing your knowledge, banishing people because you think you're in a woke competition and they're not woke enough, and you're trying to boost your own ego or virtue signal your standing in the community. And it really works hard to assume that political purity of opinions is achievable, and the way you achieve that is by shaming and bullying others. Now, there is a reason why the right wing is reacting to the call out cancel culture right now, and Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about it. Any sober assessment of this history must conclude that the present objections to cancel culture are not so much concerned with the weapon as the kind of people who now seek to wield it. Until recently, cancellation flowed exclusively downward from the powerful to the powerless. But now, in this era of fallen gatekeepers, where anyone with a Twitter handle or Facebook account can be a publisher, banishment has been ostensibly democratized. So the right wing had no problem with the cancel culture as long as they were the ones punching downward on immigrants, on people of color, on LGBT people, on women, on and on and on the disabled, etc. Now that the previous victims are punching back, it is an issue for them. But there are appropriate uses of the call out culture. You know, when there's power disparities, when people are inaccessible or unaccountable for their abuse of power. Sometimes when you try to privately call somebody in, it actually increases the harm. And so sometimes you have to call them out. You can also build community, finding others experiencing similar harms. You can spread information. You can identify unmarked or hidden structures or privileges of harm. You can lift up those voices of people who have been historically silenced. And sometimes you just want to release your pent up, pissed off outrage. And there are times, not often, but sometimes when public shaming works. But basically what we do in the human rights movement is that we magnify call outs. And Natalie Wynn writes about this in her work. First of all, if someone says, Joe at the meeting the other day said something is racist, once that's said about Joe, there'll never be a presumption of innocence, but a presumption of guilt, because it'll quickly go from Joe said something racist and gets abstracted and essentialized so that quickly goes from Joe says something racist to Joe is a racist. Now it's been attached to Joe's moral character. And then you end up with these pseudo moralists and these pseudo intellectuals say, well, I know racism and I know that Joe is a racist and I have the right to do anything I want to Joe because I'm a better person than he is. And this whole, flaunting of our virtues kind of performativity takes place. And of course, that rests on a system of false binaries, as I talked about before, the dualistic system of absolute. But this accusation against Joe also creates a culture of unforgettability and unforgivability, because Joe is in a situation where he's damned if he does and he's damned if he doesn't. Because if he tries to apologize for the perception of harm that he caused, then that apology will be read as insincere. But if he chooses not to make an apology because he doesn't know how to fix the situation, then he will be read as trying to evade accountability. And then heaven help anybody that hangs out with Joe, has lunch with Joe, cites Joe in their paper. Oh my goodness, then you're going to be called a racist too, because Joe's racism is infectious. Joe now has the political cooties and can contaminate other people. That's how magnification of a call out can go from one basic unproven observation into blowing up somebody's life. And it can happen so fast, the person doesn't even know it's taking place. So calling out becomes very toxic because it replicates that prison industrial complex that we say we're trying to avoid. It discourages people from becoming activists by frightening others into not speaking up to tell their truth. This only drives people away from the movement while we weaponize our privilege to attack other people. I'm not quite sure why we think that calling people out will hold people accountable, because why should anybody tell the truth if they expect that someone's going to jump down their throat for trying to tell the truth? And so in this way, it actually increases the harm rather than aids in the healing. And then the people who are trying to speak up and tell their truth get gaslighted. Their whole experiences get devalued. And instead of uniting people, it isolates them. And then, most dangerously, it makes people feel cynical and hopeless. And we can deal with power inappropriately through calling out, that we actually falsely claim that the best way to handle power, the abuse of power, is to demand that the power be shifted to those who have, previously not had power, who have the lived experience of being abused. I'm not so sure that's true, because this is a scarcity-based model that basically makes power transactional and believes that it's a limited commodity. And really, it creates this perception that if one group loses power to confer it to another group, this will actually create resentment of the power loss in the first group. And they very legitimately can fears of retaliation against the former power abusers. So this is based on a false solution, which really ends up often disguising power, sometimes by what I can say, presumed structurelessness, like flattening out all hierarchies and things like that, and with some very fake faux democratic practices. And actually, a lot of us use our triggers from past traumas to cause harms to others, and in fact, have the power to then justify it because I've been hurt in the past, so I have the right to make you feel as bad as I do. So there's an appropriate way to use power through calling in. And instead of trying to do a power over model, why not a shared power approach? And that way you amplify everybody's power because you're basing it on an abundance framework versus a scarcity one. And it avoids that perception of loss, but instead generates the feeling of growth, enhanced power. The way the Buddhists say it is that a lit candle loses nothing by lighting another. And it shows a pathway for those previously without power to improve themselves, but also improve the society in which they are embedded, because they avoid that master's tool trap that Audre Lorde talks about. And those who are new to power really have to be helped to not replicate the former patterns of abuse that we are talking about. And for a lot of times, it just helps us deal with our feelings about whiteness and white passing. And I just heard this term from young people, and they said spicy white people like Kim Kardashian. And I didn't know what you were talking about. She said, well, they're kind of white, but off-white because they have a lot of cultural relationship to Black people. I said, it's probably because they're Armenians, and you heard about the Armenian genocide, but that's a whole nother talk. Anyway, I want to bring Fred Hampton, because we've got to face the fact that some people say you fight fire best with fire, but we say you put the fire out best with water. We say you don't fight racism with racism, because we're going to fight racism with solidarity. So this starts with understanding your circle of influence, or what in my more cynical moments I call the don't waste your time strategy. Most of us who are on this webinar are in what I call the 90%ers, not as a reflection of our size in the population, but in the high level of unity that we have with each other, because we share common words like racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia. I don't have to list them all out. But our problem as 90%ers is that we're spending entirely too much time calling each other out for not being 100%ers. And that's when our social justice practices become entirely cannibalistic, because we don't understand that we're supposed to be 90%ers, and we're supposed to disagree 10% in a 10% way, because we are not political clones of each other. I work on human rights, someone else might work on climate change, somebody else might work on food justice or housing gentrification. It's okay, we're 90%ers. And instead of punching sideways on each other and trying to turn each other into 100%ers, we need to look a different direction. And I say, look at the 75%ers who surround us. These are people who don't share our in-group, what they call elitist language, and our ability to talk with that progressive vibe that constantly changes. But there are people who share enough worldview with us that we can create a lot of common ground. So as a Black feminist, I find the Girl Scouts my 75 percenters. They may not use the radical language that I prefer. They certainly aren't going to send the Girl Scout troops to defend an abortion clinic like I would. But at the same time, they do talk about girls and women's empowerment. And I can agree with that agenda. And they don't have to change for me to join them. I need to change so that I can join them and learn to speak at a register that they can hear and show them love and respect. Outside of the 75 percenters or the 50 percenters, these are people like my parents. My father was a Jamaican immigrant who joined the Army, became hyper patriotic, had 8 kids, stayed in the Army as a lifer. So he was also a member of the National Rifle Association because he's a weapons specialist. And he had a very interesting view of America because he joined the military in the 1930s when it was segregated. But at the same time, by the time he retired in the 1960s, he was high on patriotism and Uncle Sam and all that stuff. My mother was a conservative, Southern evangelical Baptist woman who believed that birth control was a Bible between the knees, basically. And so my parents don't share my radical language. They don't even share that 75% circle, but they do share, or I have their values, let me put it that way. For example, my mother would always make us volunteer to feed hungry and homeless people. And I talked to mom one day about that. I said, well, mom, you feed the hungry. And as a human rights activist, I asked why they're hungry in the first place. That's the difference. That's how I express your values through my work. And you can talk to all 50 percenters through working on their values, but you have to have the ability to put into your mental parking lot the words that come out of their mouth, because if you're too busy responding to their words, you'll never get to their hearts. Outside of the 50 percenters or the 25 percenters, these are the people that I normally would work to deprogram because they're people who live in an alternative reality. Their definition of freedom is their freedom not to wear a mask in the middle of a pandemic. And my definition of freedom is to end oppression. So generally speaking, as a 90 percenter, I don't have a strong skill set to effectively communicate with 25 percenters, nor will I be trusted simply because I'm a 90 percenters. And towards us, they have an eliminationist mindset. Outside of the 25 percenters or the zeros, these are the people who are actively proud to be part of the white supremacist movement. And so there is no common ground to be achieved from our 90% stance into that 0%. What can happen though, is that the 90 percenters can affect the 75 percenters and the 75 percenters can affect the 50s. And it's very possible that the 50s, like my mother and father with their conservative views, can affect the 25s and the 25s to 0. But our problem is that in our arrogance of neglecting these 75s and the 50s because they don't perfectly align with us, because we're too busy, like I said, cannibalizing each other, trying to turn ourselves into 100 percenters, that all the influence has gone the other way, the wrong way. So that ideas that used to become, that were only in the hands of people like the Ku Klux Klan and the 3 percenters and stuff, now are public policy at the hands of the Republican Party, whether it's the demonization of immigrants and Muslims or the anti-science agenda, or the banning of critical race theory. All of this stuff is happening that in a generation ago was unthinkable because it was only the KKK talking about these things. So to rethink calling out, we're going to have to avoid that us versus them mentality, focus on ourselves and our motives, prioritize our strategy, envision our outcomes, build collaboration, avoid using ousting and shame and ousting by valuing our relationships and building power together. And this requires learning a growth mindset. So what is calling in? A calling in is actually a call out done with love. You're still working to achieve accountability, but you're giving each other the benefit of the doubt instead of assuming the worst of a person simply because they said something you didn't like or whatever. And you recognize that other people can be as complicated as you are, and recognize that we're all basically trying to be on the same team, and we're supposed to have differences of opinion with each other. And remember the broader context. I hate those gotcha moments where somebody gets called out for something they said 2 decades ago, and then it gets weaponized against them now without any examination of whether they've grown in that period. So, why would you hold something against somebody 20 years ago when you are just lucky nobody had a cell phone to record you 20 years ago? It does require using active, loving, listening practices and being grateful that we have this time together. Calling in begins with self-assessment. Before you decide that you're going to invest in another person's growth, you have to make sure that you're in a healed enough space to do so. You have to be able to put your reactions and your emotions in that parking lot so that you can pay close attention to other people. And so if you're still walking around wounded from the microaggressions or the stabs that people have given your soul, then you're not in a calling out in space. As a matter of fact, I recommend that you don't do it, because all you do is inflict more harm through your trauma. It also requires that you don't have the magic wand to change other people. If that were true, we could change our partners, we could change our coworkers, we could change. I would like a magic wand to just make my students turn in their papers on time. I mean, we don't have that magic power, but we can offer love and respect, and we can agree to disagree. And that's okay, because people have the right to different opinions. And I'm gonna close by saying, but it all starts with learning how to forgive yourself for your past mistakes so that you can develop the capacity for forgiving others. And when you were a child and you think about how your mistakes that you made as a child were handled, if you were punished or shamed for your mistakes, then it's likely that's how you think you're supposed to treat other people, with punishment and shame. But when you made a mistake as a child, if you were counseled and forgiven for your mistakes, then chances are that's the grace and forgiveness you're going to be able to offer other people. So I'm gonna close with stop sharing and say, think about how your mistakes were handled and make a decision whether you want to handle other people's mistakes in a different way. So I went 5 minutes over time, I'm sorry, but I wanted to get as much in as I could and leave enough time for Q&A.
Loretta, I don't think that you have to say I'm sorry whatsoever. The education that you've just provided us is invaluable, and I want to start by thanking you for calling us into this conversation this evening and allowing us the ability to think critically about ourselves in context of the world around us, and how we help each other become better as a part of it. So thank you. Anthony, you ready to kick off the Q&A?
Go.
I will tell you, Loretta, that you may not realize it, but early on in your presentation, you mentioned something that we've had a lot of conversation about here at MIT, the concept of meritocracy.
Mm.
I was wondering if you could talk a bit about it. What are some of the problematic aspects of meritocracy, and how can we maybe shift our thinking about it? Maybe even more, how can we call people in to think critically about meritocracy?
And I think what complicates the discussion of meritocracy is that when we criticize the unlevel, uneven playing field in which discussions of meritocracy take place, to our opponents, it sounds like we're criticizing people's personal efforts to achieve, to do well, to do good, to excel. And that's not true. The problem is that there are some people like, what did Ann Richards say? Ann Richards, the former governor of Texas, talked about George Bush. and he was born with a silver foot in his mouth, which I thought was just precious. But you can't say that he was the sharpest knife in the closet. You know what I'm saying? It was not a meritorious system. We have so many built-in advantages to our system that we actually don't get a true merit, a measure of people's merits. Because some people just start off on third base and thought they hit a home run, as opposed to people who, weren't even allowed on the baseball diamond until they were in their 50s, that kind of thing. And so we've got to stop believing in the false blandishment of a meritocratic system, I guess, because it doesn't really exist. We all have some combination of privileges and vulnerabilities, advantages and disadvantages, that it would be more scientific to calculate those rather than assume that there's a level playing field and we're all starting off at the same starting gate. And what makes a difference in your outcome depends on how much effort you put into it. That's simply not true, but it is a myth that props up white supremacy.
So Loretta, I'll pose the next question. Some people are uncomfortable using words like anti-racism and white privilege. Can you talk about the importance of vocabulary and what are the hurdles that people get stuck at?
Well, I think if I had cancer, I'd be uncomfortable with the word too, but I'd rather hear the word than ignore the cancer. I mean, that's how we have to deal with it. These words are not designed to make us comfortable. They're designed to make us think. Okay? And if you want comfort, then maybe you can retreat back into the womb, because that's going to be the last comfortable, safe place you existed. Growth is a matter of friction, as any physics person can tell you. Anyway, and it requires discomfort. Unlearning what you thought you knew so that you can learn new things. But if you're very stuck on what you think you already know about white supremacy, race, or anything else, then your mind's like that closed parachute that won't really function. So you really need to lean into the discomfort. I once asked a very powerful woman who was always getting harassed by trolls and stuff, what did she do? Because her name was always in the newspaper. They were doxing her family because she was a famous leader of Planned Parenthood. And I asked Gloria one day, I said, how do you put up with that? Because I don't know if I want my children's pictures in newspapers and stuff for the Klan to go after these anti-abortion. She said, Loretta, you have to learn that when the tsunami is coming, you can either try to run from it and recognize that you can't run fast enough to outrun a tsunami, or you turn your surfboard into it and ride that sucking wave out. And she taught me about riding the wave out, because that's the way you survive, not from running from discomfort and conflict, but turning into it so that you can become stronger. And that's what I really privilege. I really love learning more about being a better human being. And doesn't mean I'm not afraid. I'm always scared. I'm a scaredy cat. I've just learned not to let my emotions and my fear control the choices that I make.
Wow. I would say that my next question actually kind of starts there. Calling out or calling in can also be kind of a fearful moment for a lot of people who maybe aren't accustomed to engaging people. What are some real practical ways or practical phrases that people can use maybe to invite others into a conversation?
I do online trainings, which, by the way, $5 a lesson. You can get them in my website. There goes the commercial, lorettajross.com. Next class starts June 1. The whole body of classes is all of $20. You can afford it, I think. Anyway, in those classes, I teach people 3 or 4 helpful sentences. Like, when you use that word, I'm not sure if I quite understood what you meant. Tell me more. Most people cannot resist an invitation to tell you more about themselves. Or you can say, at some point In the room, everybody got quiet. I think the temperature dropped. Can we go back to that moment and see what happened when everything changed? If you learn 2 or 3 helpful sentences like that and just practice them over and over, then you'll become braver about calling people in or out. But let's be clear, it's like riding a bicycle. You're going to fall off a couple of times, but you got to get back on it and try riding it again, because we're totally going against that freeze, fight, or flight instinct that we have, and using not our reptilian brain, but our higher consciousness in order to walk in the world a different way. And that requires practice, conscious practice.
Okay, Loretta, we have another one in here in the chat. When calling into the 75 or 50%, what types of conversations are most effective? If we want to help people move over time, where do we start, and how do we keep the conversation going over the long term?
That depends on whether you have a relationship with the person. I know that I have a lot of conservatives in my family, mainly because of religion. And so if I have a relationship with Uncle Frank, as I call it, the Uncle Frank strategy, I'll just turn to Uncle Frank and say, Uncle Frank, I'm your niece, and I know you're a really good man, Uncle Frank. I even know that you'd run into a burning building if you could to save somebody. And you wouldn't care what race they were, whether they were an immigrant, whether they were gay. I know you, Uncle Frank. You are that good that you would save a stranger. So Uncle Frank, help me reconcile the good man that I know you are with the words that keep coming out of your mouth about gay people and immigrants and Black people. Uncle Frank, really? Which Uncle Frank do I have? The loving one or the mean one? That's a classic calling on strategy, because you neither called Uncle Frank out for the words that he said, because you're going to put those in the parking lot. You're not calling him in, but you're calling on Uncle Frank to address his own cognitive dissonance, the difference between how he thinks he's a good guy inside, but outside he's practicing stuff that is definitely problematic. So if you have a relationship with the person, you always can use some version of the Uncle Frank strategy. Now, if the person is a total stranger to you, I tend to use a calling on strategy as well, because I'll just, like I said, look at them and say, I'm not quite sure how I'm walking through the world that makes you think you can say those kinds of things to me. Like if they said something racist about somebody or sexist or whatever. And so I'll just say something like that, and then determine from their response, what my next step will be. Because if they double down on the remarks that they made that I find problematic, and they don't want to admit the harm that their remarks are causing, and they don't want to do any better, then that increases the chances that I'm going to call them out, or for my own sanity, walk away. But if they show a willingness to admit that they've made a mistake, and they're willing to repair the harm that they did and learn how to do better and effectively apologize, then I'm going to stay with them a little bit longer and help them walk away from the dark side, And so, but that's a choice I get to make with strangers, to decide whether or not they're worth investing in, or should I put them in the don't waste your time category kind of thing. And that's why it has to be voluntary, because you're not obligated to help people grow. I do it because my integrity calls for it. Your reputation, as Lois McMaster Bujold writes, and I love science fiction, so I'm always quoting somebody writing speculative or science fiction. She says your reputation is what others think that they know about you, but your integrity is what you know about yourself. Damn the reputation, work to protect your own integrity, because you have to sleep with yourself every night, and you'll never be able to control what other people think about you. And you find the most unhappy people walking through life trying to protect their reputations instead of their integrity. And so that'll help me decide, is investing in you helping me protect my integrity, Or are you trying to, drag me down to that sunken place that you find so comfortable?
So Loretta, along those lines, whoa, there's a weird echo. Here's another one. And you mentioned this earlier in your presentation with regards to social media. So let's see. What are some really basic ways to break people out of the us versus them, good activism versus bad activism binaries? I notice this is an issue with a lot of young online activists, and social media doesn't help.
Well, I think that they've learned how to be an activist on social media the wrong way, because they've learned that, there is that binary, and either you're doing it right or you're doing it wrong. And they're working very earnestly trying to get it right. But they're going to fail at that project, because all social justice work is just one big human experiment. We're going to fail 99 times before we hit that 100th sweet spot. And so they don't have a real accurate way of understanding how you do social justice work. And so they certainly don't have self-forgiveness, and they think that they're in charge of the timeline. So that if they work really hard, it doesn't change in 2 years, they give up, they become cynical. But I find that when I teach these techniques to young people, they're actually kind of glad, because they're tired and exhausted of walking around like a lit grenade trying to blow up other people's lives. They're not having fun doing the work in that style. And I talk to a lot of them who say, I don't even like who I become on social media. I become a troll on social media, always calling out people, always judging people. And then I won't buy a t-shirt for fear that someone will call me out for wearing the wrong t-shirt or whatever. And so they don't like walking around on political eggshells. And so they're actually happy to find that's not the right way to do social justice work. That you're really supposed to do it with love, respect from your heart, self-forgiveness, because you're going to be making a lot of mistakes, and you have to forgive others for making their mistakes. But there's many paths up to the mountaintop, not just one. Yeah, and so we have to teach these things. I think part of the problem is that within academia, we're teaching radical analyses without radical practices to accompany them. So that people weaponize the analysis instead of knowing how to use it responsibly, because the heaviest privilege in the world is consciousness. And we don't teach people how to use that in an effective way.
Loretta, thank you. There's a question that came through that I'll say is pretty interesting, and I'll read it. I really resonate with your example of the dilemma of the 90%ers cannibalizing each other and dismissing 75%ers for not being close enough in ideology. On campus right now, there's so much distrust between students and administrators and faculty. Do you have advice for administrators on how to call in 90%ers, call in the 90%er in the students?
Well, you got to make sure that that administrator who's so convinced about their own anti-racist credentials that they haven't excavated that liberal resentment they have within their own souls. I'll give you an example that happened at Smith College. By definition, many faculty of color have to do overload labor, which is basically be there for students of color, even if they're not their students, but at a predominantly white institution. This is what faculty of color do. They provide that open door, that listening, that support, because they know what academia is like, right? And so when I was asking, a decision maker at my college, what were we going to do about compensating the overload for faculty of color who have to deal with, and particularly Smith has been in the headlines a lot. You notice this, right? By the way. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on in our campus. And the person decided that I was talking to basically said that, well, Loretta, we can't compensate the faculty of color because the rest of the faculty think it's a matter of equity. And I had to process this academic gobbledygook. I'm like, wait a moment. Are you telling me that the faculty who are not doing the extra work get to veto whether the faculty who are doing the work get paid. I said, what kind of capitalist system are you working under? Because I've never seen a system where the non-workers get to determine whether the workers get paid. That's how these hidden injustices happen within our colleges and universities, and we justify them as tradition without recognizing that we're maintaining white supremacy when we do those kinds of things. Yeah, and then that same lack of appreciating the overload is the same reason that the faculty of color won't leap to become a department chair or serve on 5 different committees because they're already doing more work that they're not getting paid for. So why should they volunteer for more? And so the higher you go up the pyramid, the wider it gets. You know, we need to change. We can do better because we're teaching some radical analyses, but we're not embracing the radical practices that go along with it.
So, Loretta, thank you for being with us today. Unfortunately, we're going to have to close. I mean, there's so much to unpack here, and unfortunately, we weren't able to get to everyone's questions. We are keeping the chat, so possibly we can do some follow-ups or things of that nature.
But share the recording.
And share the recording, yes. And so, what we've been able to experience today and talk through today is an acknowledgement of the complexities that come with anti-racism work, white supremacist systems that are in place, and how we reconcile with those complexities in a manner that facilitates community growth and development. The intentional investment in growth and development, it's calling out with love. It's giving people the benefit of the doubt, and something that I truly believe, particularly with those that are in attendance this evening, and as well as our environment that we espouse to create within MIT and our respective communities, is that we really are trying to be on the same team. We're going to have differences. We're going to disagree. We're going to make mistakes, but we have to be able to engage with one another in a manner where you can forgive yourself first,
right,
and then be able to forgive others. And I think this is the basis. There's so many more conversations to be had, so much more work to be done. But if we enter into a mindset where we're here to support one another and to acknowledge the disparate impacts that are going on within our society, we're not saying we need to turn a blind eye to it. We do need to address it. We need to acknowledge it. But it's a matter in terms of how we enter into these conversations and the manner in which we bring people in, as opposed to calling out.